Hello, Stephen. Thank you for joining us and taking part in HQTS's Industry Expert Interview Series. Really amazing to have you here today. Before we begin, it'd be really great for our viewers for you to introduce yourself and your role in Assent Compliance.
Sure, thank you very much, and good day, everybody. Yes, my name's Steve Andrews, and I work for a company called Assent Compliance. They're based in Canada, but they have a global locations in Europe, Malaysia, and also in Eldoret in Kenya. And we're a software as a solution company. We have a compliance platform that allows companies to get in contact with their supply chains and build up all the data to declare compliance with all the relevant product legislation in Europe and North America. My particular background was that for many years, I worked on these issues for the UK government, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. I left that post in March 2019 and joined Assent in 2019, and I'm now a subject matter expert for Assent Compliance.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Stephen. I think with your experience, our audience is really going to benefit from your insights in today's interview. So great. Thank you for being here. So today we're going to be discussing the latest trends, regulations, and updates in the electrical and electronics industries and how companies can stay up to date and compliant within it. So let's get cracking right into it with question one. In your opinion, how the electronics industry, how is it changing in terms of technology, operations, business models in recent years? And
Yeah, sure. Yeah, very interesting question. And obviously the development of the electronics industry over the past 50 plus years has been one of continuous change, continuous innovation, and also alongside it, continuous challenge. It's had a tremendous impact on the lives of literally everyone on the planet, from those living in the most densely populated cities to those living in the most remote locations. The IT industry now plays an essential role of virtually every industrial sector, from that of manufacturing household consumer equipment, to those in communications, to those in transport, to those in healthcare, particularly relevant at the moment, and so on. It's almost impossible now to imagine a world without electronic devices or circuitry, and the Internet of Things now makes those sectors interdependent and relying on each other to a degree never before imagined. The Global Electronics Components Market Research Report for 2020 suggests that the global market for electronic components will grow at a compound annual growth rate of almost 5% between 2020 and 2025, and it is expected to reach a value of somewhere in the region of $500,000 million US by that year. But that's not been without its challenges, and huge and continual investment by the biggest global brands has been needed to maintain their market presence. The sourcing of critical materials from reliable, robust and ethical supply chains is and will continue to be a huge obstacle to overcome. And environmental sustainability is now given as a benchmark for future growth and prosperity. What will be the driving force behind future change and the future developments of the sector? Well, your guess is probably as good as mine, but it's certain that the Internet of Things will become more and more pervasive. Artificial intelligence will play an increasing role, and higher demands on the technologies will require higher performance and greater speeds, of course. These developments all bring potentially greater risk of data security breaches, which means the ways in which these risks are overcome will also need to be developed, and developed fast if the sector is to avoid undermining its own success.
Wow, thank you for that answer. I think, like you said, things are always evolving and changing at a very rapid rate. And as you said, with technology, data is such an important aspect of looking to how we can secure that. So thank you very much. So moving on, speaking about RoHS, actually, obviously the European Commission recently published its final report on the evaluation of hazardous substances, or RoHS directive in April. Could you summarize some of the key points which kind of manufacturers, suppliers, and retailers need to know about the directive? Nuggets?
Sure, happy to do so. In fact, the RoHS directive is the one that is most closest to my heart. I've worked on it since the original directive was agreed in 2002. I didn't do the negotiations on that but I did the turning it into the UK laws and then negotiated RoHS 2 for the UK government with my colleagues in the European Commission. So yeah, RoHS directive is now 18 years old, amazingly, because it was first published in February 2003. First version came into force, as many people will know, in mid-26, and a second iteration was agreed 5 years later and came into force in January 2013. That second RoHS directive placed an obligation on the European Commission to undertake a general review of its effectiveness, alongside a need to examine its scope and product coverage. The groundwork for that review was initiated by the Commission, for the Commission by two consultancies, Acoris, based in the Netherlands, and Ramboll, who are a Danish company. Public consultations were undertaken between September and December 2019, and a stakeholder workshop was held in 2020.
Steven,
Report findings were submitted to the Commission and published in March this year. 5 key issues were addressed. Was the directive effective? Was it relevant? Did it have coherence with other legislation? Efficiency? And did it have EU added value? So what were the outcomes? On effectiveness, did the directive achieve its objectives? Yes, the study found that there was a reduction of around 67% in the levels of hazardous substances that have been used in the manufacture of electrical equipment since 2002. And that would be mainly the 6 original RoHS substances, not the 4 phthalates that were added later. Relevance: were the objectives of the directive in line with the needs of protecting human health and the environment? Again, the report found yes, but suggested the directive needed to be more flexible in its response to new issues. Coherence: how does RoHS fit with other EU legislation, such as the REACH regulation, the WEEE directive, Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment, the Eco-Design Directive, and Persistent Organic Pollutants Directive? And RoHS was judged to contribute well to the circular economy and to the functioning of the single market across Europe. Efficiency: are the costs justified against the benefits? Another yes. The majority of the stakeholders that were consulted agreed that the environmental and health benefits outweighed the compliance and enforcement costs. But obviously the responses they got to that particular part of the inquiries would have been a wide spectrum from one end to the other. And finally, EU added value. Would the same outcome have been achieved without harmonised action across the European Union? The answer here was no, because if individual member state countries had introduced their own laws, it was felt that this would have disrupted business activities. So the overall conclusion drawn was that the directive had been successful in reaching the objective of reducing hazardous substances in electrical and electronic equipment. It had also contributed to the harmonisation and functioning of the internal single market. That's the free movement of goods across the whole of the 27 member states. But there are a few areas of possible improvement that have been identified. So what might we expect in a RoHS 3? Well, your guess again is as good as mine, because we don't know what the Commission is drafting. We're expecting the results of that process to come out probably in the first quarter of 2022. But we can guess on the sort of areas they're looking at. For instance, they'll be looking at additional substances. Will the list of restricted substances be extended beyond the current 10 that are under the RoHS directive? 7 new substances were actually proposed by the European Commission in 2018, but it now looks as if only 2 of those will be recommended for inclusion, and that's TBBPA and medium chain chlorinated paraffins, MCCPS. On scope, will the exclusions be reviewed? The key exclusions to the RoHS directive, of course, are the large-scale stationary industrial tools, large-scale fixed installations, and solar panels. Then, we move on to what will the form of the legislation actually be? Will it be a new 3rd directive, or will it be a European regulation? A directive, of course, has to be turned into the local laws of each country. So a French RoHS, a German RoHS, an Italian RoHS, etc. But if it's a European regulation, it applies directly and in full across all the member states. And what will the interface be with other legislation, like with REACH, for example? Will it be more harmonised with REACH, and will the same substances come up for consideration under both pieces of legislation? Finally, will there be a review of the exemption process, the technical exemptions where you're allowed to use some of those substances above the maximum concentration values? A new exemption methodology was actually published in June last year, but will issues around timelines for approvals, expiries and amendments be addressed? Will deadlines and expiry dates be synchronized, which they're not at the moment, which causes a lot of confusion for industry? Only time will tell, of course. And as I said, the first proposals were due actually next week by July 22nd, but we now understand they've been postponed and should appear in the first half of next year.
That's great. Thank you for such an insightful answer. Obviously quite a lot in that to take in for people, but I think it's beneficial to get the information further. Yeah, thank you for that. So speaking about, you spoke about the WEEE, about electronic waste. Our third question to you is that how can companies comply with regulations about electronics and electrical waste, or e-waste?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you probably know, the RoHS directive was also negotiated at the same time and proposed as the associated waste electrical and electronic equipment directive. In fact, they were one big directive originally under the proposals, and then they were separated out because it was such a big issue to tackle. So the end of life waste directive, waste electrical and electronic equipment directive, was negotiated separately, while the RoHS directive, which looks at the original manufacturing of the same products, became a different piece of legislation. And the WEEE directive is what we call in Europe a minimum requirements directive. It's not a single market directive like RoHS. So this means that all the 27 EU member states must implement and enforce all its requirements. But unlike RoHS, they can impose stricter obligations if they want to, so they can go beyond those minimum requirements. So the WEEE directive, or WEEE directive, as many in Europe call it, is all about producer responsibility and arises from the principle that those that place products and equipment on the market should take full responsibility for the ways in which those products are disposed of and recycled at the end of life disposal stage. And so in reality, this means that companies are usually required to contribute to a country or region's waste management infrastructure, or at least the collection and disposal of electrical goods. They do this through membership of a state-run or private company scheme. Although the main objective of the WEEE directive is to minimise the environmental impact of electrical and electronic goods, it does have a subsidiary aim to promote the efficient use of resources. So the retrieval of secondary raw materials through reuse, recycling and other forms of recovery is promoted and encouraged by the directive. But joining a producer compliance or national compliance scheme and providing sales information to the National Environment Agency are only parts of a company's obligations under the WEEE legislation. In addition, companies must put a crossed-out wheelie bin on the products and equipments that they sell or distribute. They must ensure that full information is made freely available on the correct treatment and reprocessing of all electrical and electronic components and materials. And they must ensure that their distributors or their retailers pass on that information about recycling and disposal options for the products to the consumers and other end users. And finally, they must keep the documentation related to the products for inspection by the national authorities whenever necessary for a period of up to 10 years after the product was placed on the market. Like the RoHS directive, the original WEEE directive underwent a substantial revision around 10 years ago, and its success and impact is regularly reviewed by the European Commission and the individual member state governments. So they're looking at how much the rate of recycling of electrical goods has gone up, and they have targets that they have to meet, which are increasing every 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephen. And from what I'm aware, I know recently distributors are being required to physically take back electrical goods and waste. And I know that's something that was implemented quite recently, if I'm not mistaken. So, see, like you said, having that responsibility is very key and important. So, yeah, again, thank you.
Certainly is, yes.
Yeah, keeping it circular. So, kind of moving on from that, we're talking about counterfeiting and kind of how, in your opinion, can retailers and distributors minimize counterfeiting and ensure that the products they buy from suppliers are actually what they claim to be?
Yeah, that's a really big issue, and it's an unfortunate fact that counterfeiting of goods is actually really commonplace, not only in Europe, but across the globe. The OECD has estimated that the trade in counterfeit goods accounts for nearly 5% or over 5% of total world trade. So that's a huge amount of business being lost to the legitimate companies. So it's no surprise to note that the more successful that any brand becomes, the more likely it is to find itself the target of counterfeiting. But it's not only the final goods that might be counterfeit. Companies can also fall victim when purchasing parts, components, and sub-assemblies to incorporate within their products and equipment, which can obviously cause problems with failures and not being up to the right standard. So how can these retailers, distributors, and other players in the supply chain play their part to minimize this threat? The first action is, of course, to ensure that the trademark or patent of any product is in place. And it needs to be in place not only on a local basis where you're selling the goods, but on a global basis, because the counterfeiting is done outside those markets. So rather than just in the markets where the goods are sold or distributed. Secondly, documentation needs to be scrutinized really carefully. If the supplier is one that has been working with those retailers, manufacturers, and distributors on a long-term and regular basis, it can reasonably be assured that they're trusted and are supplying what they're supposed to supply. If you're using someone new, you need to be careful. Monitoring suppliers closely and undertaking regular audits are essential, but contractual provisions put into the wording put into the contracts with those suppliers can also be employed to guard against counterfeit goods finding their way into your products and into your market. The next point is use technology. Marks to show the authenticity of a product or a component part can be used to ensure the validity of the product's legal status. And then finally, you need to have a crisis management plan in place so that if any counterfeiting arises, you can combat it successfully, minimize the damage, and avoid the reputational impact before it takes effect.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I understand that basically you have to be very vigilant. Organizations must be aware and have these very careful look at actually who they're working with.
Absolutely.
Some other different kind of brands are implementing blockchain and technology, as you said, to try and be on top of these counterfeitings and have that kind of process all the way through. So yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you very much. Our final question to you today is regarding supply data chain management. And that is, what is the role of supply chain data management and how is it applied in the electrical and electronics industry specifically?
Yeah, sure. And of course, this is where a company like Assent Compliance and other people in the same sort of field can help, because supply chains run deep in the electrical and electronics industry, of course, many tiers deep. And adherence to international standards like IEC 63000 is actually imperative to business continuity. Supply chain data management is vitally important for all manufacturing sectors, particularly where product-related legislation applies to them. But unfortunately, the management of supply chain data is a massive undertaking, and that can disrupt the responsibilities of the employees across the company. It can also disrupt the day-to-day work of logistics partners, distributors, retailers, and of course the end users. According to the 2020 State of Compliance report, 88% of companies expected to spend more time and money on compliance over the next 3 years than they ever had done before. And as a result of that, many companies, particularly in the electrical and electronics field, have begun to look outside their organizations for support. More and more are choosing to engage a chain data management partner that can take on the responsibility of managing their product compliance, their corporate social responsibility, and their vendor management programs, from identifying products in scope and providing regulatory guidance to managing their supplier outreach and submitting data to regulatory bodies. And that's particularly important at the moment with the development in Europe of the SCIP database that's managed for the European Commission by the European Chemicals Agency. So allowing another company to do this gives the company time to reassign their internal resources while still being confident that they can meet requests for compliance information from any enforcement bodies that might come knocking on the door, and indeed from their customers up and down their supply chain. The best supply chain data management partners have secure supplier and component part data libraries, and they can be used to supplement programs leading to more streamlined data collection and cleaner supplier data. And a lot of them employ artificial intelligence to do that as a first pass over the information that's given to them. Another key feature of having a compliance partner, of course, is the ability to manage a wide range of data requirements and regulations, because the needs arise from, as I've already said, from people like the European Chemical Agency in Europe, but there's also the US Environment Protection Agency, the EPA, in North America, and their TSCA regime is now becoming more stringent and placing more substances on their control list. Legislation and markets are constantly changing, and the demand for more ethical products is now rapidly expanding, of course, especially as the demand for precious metals, raw materials and minerals rise in the production of electrical and electronic components. And the push to create a more circular economy forces companies to rethink how they do their business. And this is being pushed by the policies of the European Commission and other sort of governments around the world. So bottom line is that businesses that invest in a supply chain data management partner set themselves up for more streamlined and successful business.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It does sound like this is a very, very good benefit to people in this industry, being able to be agile and always able to adapt to the ever-evolving regulations. So fantastic. Thank you very much. And with that final point, that's actually all the questions we had for you today, all the time we had today. So I would firstly like to thank you so much for joining us, Stephen, today at HQTS, and we appreciate your insight and look forward to having you next time.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure to work with you this morning, and hope that's been useful for people who might view this later on. Thank you.